Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Adler, Executive Sales Director here at Blis, and thank you for joining us today for our live webinar where we will be discussing the current state of digital advertising and explore the evolving strategies to embrace a cookieless future. To give you a little background, Blis is a world leader in cookie-free omnichannel advertising, and we've been helping some of the world's biggest brands navigate the bleeding edge of digital advertising since 2004. And 20 years later, after GDPR, CCPA, and all the data and privacy regulations centered around consumers' privacy, we believe that this year presents one of the greatest challenges, but also yet one of the greatest opportunities for brands to get ahead and embrace an entirely new dynamic in advertising. We're really lucky here at Blis to have some incredibly talented people working to fuel our insights and technology to develop game-changing products. And I'm happy to share that you'll be hearing from 3 of those experts today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brooke Bender and Alex Wright from our Insights team, who are first going to take you through the results of our latest study, 2024 and the Great Privacy Disconnect, followed by our solutions that will be walked through by our CTO, Aaron McKee.
Okay, thanks for that, Lori. So let's go ahead and start with the core of why we're here. If fewer than 46% of Americans even know what cookies are, why are they one of the primary drivers in the move to eradicate them? Now, they might not know what cookies are, but consumers do know that they should be aware of and concerned about what information is floating around online about them and how that information is being used. So what brought on this awareness? Was it general data breaches? And is this legitimate concerns about data security? Is it the cookie pop-ups that they see on literally any website that they visit? Or is this about consumers feeling frustrated and just really wanting more control over their own personal data? Because 86% of Americans believe that businesses and organizations collect more information about them than what they actually need. So, Alex, how are these things contributing to how consumers and marketers feel about cookies?
Well, to break that down into the consumer and the marketing chunks, I think from a consumer point of view, if there's no obvious or actually if there's no equal value exchange, then the relationships risk feeling one-sided. And a one-sided relationship tends not to be a healthy relationship. And I think that's what consumers picked up on. Really, it's this sense or perception of violation rather than any hard rejection of cookies or what they bring to the table. So I think, if anything, it's exaggerated the issue potentially and turned it into something more than it needed to be. Also, cookies, what they've come to represent, I think, as this tool to chase people around the internet, are being lumped in with some of the more nefarious or just negligent data practices that have hit the headlines more. So even though they've tended to be more about first-party data and the challenges in storing and managing that, it's often entirely unrelated to advertising, and third-party cookies have just been tarred with the same brush. I think from a marketing perspective, the second point there, we, include myself in this, and I think speak on behalf of a lot of the industry, we've been bewitched by the amount of data there is out there to use. Whether we've harnessed it ourselves, gathered it ourselves, brought it in, or accessed it from intermediaries, we're hooked. Right? We can't stop. There's certainly an element of FOMO there as well, because we don't want to be left behind. And I think so data, if it's used wisely, can be a huge source of competitive advantage. And so we've ploughed a lot of time, energy, resource, and expertise into gathering this data and conjured up new roles and entire departments to look after it. So we can't stop now. There's a lot of sunken cost in it as well. And it's entirely hinged on the belief that having more is better. But I'm not entirely sure that's the case. The withdrawal of the cookie, like the reduction in visible mobile IDs, has caused panic because we're losing something, which is always a more potent feeling. It's a bit like a Stockholm syndrome. Right? We're moving away. And we feel sadness about that, but it's just because it's what we're used to, not necessarily because it's what's best. And now we're having to confront that. We're into the hard part, really. So managing change or addressing change and having to assess alternative solutions. And for the people making those decisions, there's a lot riding on it. So I think there's sympathy and also huge empathy with a lot of our contemporaries in the media space as they try and maintain some sense of business as usual and competitive advantage on this while going through what is really a generational change for the industry.
For sure. That's definitely really interesting. And so, if we try to sum it all up, when we think about what this means for marketers, I think the honest answer is that we just don't know yet. Everyone right now kind of has their hand up saying their solution is the best, but there are a lot of pros and cons that still need to be explored. And we feel that at the end of the day, in a sea of solutions, the best one is going to be the one still standing when that tide goes out. So the concern right now, though, that people are experiencing is very real. Will we still be able to do business and personalize advertising messaging and figure out how to target the best audiences? And where is that data going to come from?
Well, to that very point, I think there's an argument that personalized advertising, I don't even know if personalized is quite the right word, but personalized advertising and audience targeting has gone too far. We've covered this to some extent in the previous question from almost a consumer outrage perspective, like getting the pitchforks out, and this has gone too far. But what about from an advertising perspective, the practicalities of running effective campaigns? Because the more targeting capabilities you have, the more you tend to use, and the narrower your beam of focus gets as a result. So this can be efficient for sure, and that's the direction the industry's increasingly taken over the last decade or two. But that's not the same as it being effective. Right? So our frame of reference, we've got a bit of tunnel vision on this. We've been a bit myopic, right? We've certainly in digital advertising anyway, our frame of reference has shrunk, right? And we've obsessed about lower funnel activations, lower funnel metrics, ones that focus on identifying an in-market consumer and nudging them into purchase. It's all about percentages as a measure of success. And the flip side of that, or the collateral damage in that, is that we've taken our eye off the ball a little bit for the other end of the funnel, where it's about generating demand, getting people interested in a brand, slowly developing that relationship with them, and tying that to business goals, not just kind of small, finite campaign successes, the percentage conversion and ROAS and things like that. This is about units sold, revenue generated, profits grown. Okay, and I think we need to get our heads back into that space here. But I'm not disclosure, just keen to caveat at this point, really, that I'm not advocating for one position over the other. They're both of huge value, but it's just that the pendulum feels like it's swung a little too close to the lower end of the funnel for a little too long. So even as the visible IDs reduce, on the other hand, on the other side of the fence almost, is the increasing digitization of what previously would have been traditional or analog channels. Right? So the ability to carve up that inventory in a way that better fits audiences is simply a new way of targeting and a new thing for us to test and a new thing for us to wrap our heads around. So as the sun sets on third-party cookies in one advertising hemisphere, there's a new dawn breaking in what was once the traditional ad space. And really, I'll come onto this in a second, I think, Brooke, but even as of late last year, the stat that's on the slide now, half of US marketers didn't have a plan for cookieless advertising. And I'm tempted to almost take the devil's advocate position here and say, is it a bad thing? In the future where more exposure to advertising will happen via platforms where you can't connect an ID, how valuable is a cookie anymore?
Right. And if everyone knows that this is an issue and it's going to define what happens in this industry in 2024 and moving forward, we have to think about those things. And right now, 98% of marketers say they're concerned about cookies being phased out. But it turns out that change is really, really hard. And many have built their whole careers on the backs of this technology. So 75% are still relying on cookies, even though we know that they're going away. And this is going to be an issue that gets more critical by the day. When you place it in context, Chrome began testing the auto restriction of third-party cookies for just 1% of users this past January. And that 1% represents 30 million global users. So each percentage point is going to be 30 million consumers that will just evaporate from the view of marketers. And billions will become unreachable without a good alternative solution to cookies. And if we place that in terms of dollars, the loss of cookies could cost advertisers $10 billion in lost revenue.
So you're saying this is a big issue, right? I think there's legitimate concern, understandably so. It's the biggest change, like we mentioned a few moments ago, biggest change the industry's seen in a very, very long time, particularly those for whom they built careers and businesses on cookies. Right? To have the rug pulled out from underneath you, even if it's taking a very, very long time to finally tweak the last threads of the rug out, it's a big change to get used to. But again, on the flip side, I hope that as an industry who prides itself on innovation and living in the zeitgeist, this should be an invigorating experience as well, just another test for us to overcome. I'll argue it's a problem we brought on ourselves as well by maybe misusing this tool that we were given access to in the past.
Okay, so we know we should be concerned. So how do we start to shift to feeling more prepared when there are so many options out there? And it's just not going to be practical or cost effective to kind of test and evaluate each one individually. And you have to think, if agency holding companies, they might be hesitant to release findings and share findings about their own testing when finding a solution that works is what's going to help them maintain a competitive advantage in the market. So why don't we here talk about two potential solutions, the privacy sandbox and unified IDs? So Alex, what are your views on those?
I have my views are based on a relatively lay understanding of what they are and what they represent, which I feel reasonably comfortable confessing to, because I think it's a sentiment shared across a lot of the industry. So the privacy sandbox, which I think is a vaguely entertaining name in the first place, because it's, Aaron will correct me here, but it's tech speak for a test environment, right? So it alludes to the fact that this is an iteration. It's not necessarily the very end game for what Google hope to offer the market. At its core, it takes in your recent browsing history and spits out your top topics. These topics are the second generation version of Phlox, which again was kind of based on the principles of homophilia. Phlox is an entertaining name. Birds of a feather flock together. That was the idea behind it, I believe. And once they've got your topics, they delete them after a while, refresh them with some new ones, so it stays relatively current. And while this loosens the ties to individual data, it softens the definitions that were useful to those publishers and retailers in the first place. Unified IDs is probably the second one that's got a lot of interest, arguably less traction than interest at the moment, but that is picking up. And this operates independent of third-party cookies, but does depend on actually more individual detail to an extent. We're talking email addresses and phone numbers, which, despite, like I said, adoption by some publishers, and I think some relatively big ones have got on board recently as well, it might be a stretch for many consumers to play ball in this one. I mean, speaking on my own behalf, I've never declined a cookie, neither online nor at a tea party. So I'm not averse to this. I think probably worst case scenario, you get a bad ad. Best case, you get something that's relevant and useful to you in the moment. But what these options leave you with is essentially a choice between scale without detail or detail without scale. And not being able to reconcile between profiles and across data sources leaves a lot of dark corners here, a lot of unknowns. So I suppose the question for the industry is to go back to the consumers and say, like, do you want personalization or do you want privacy? And the challenge for us is to find the balance between the two.
Right. Definitely a lot to consider there too. And I think if you were at a party, you'd probably be offered a biscuit and not a cookie. But clearly there are going to be some pros and cons to each one. And that's just going to be multiplied when you consider other platforms and technologies that are also saying that they're the solution. Some are going to fit certain use cases better than others. But Are these solutions missing the point entirely? And should we as an industry be concentrating on ways to remove identification from the conversation altogether? And so this is what we're calling the great privacy disconnect. People want personalization, meaning ads relevant to their lives without compromising their privacy. And to this point, the industry seems to be unable to deal with this mass unplugging and seems to be kind of kicking the can down the road. But the reality is that the end of the road is approaching and no one has a good plan in place yet for what to do moving forward.
Well, I think some do. Some do have a reasonable plan. So in the spirit of balance here, I think some are perfectly very well adapted actually for a cookieless future because they didn't rely on cookies in the first place. They weren't businesses built around that. So I don't want to get too sidetracked by that, but there's retail media is a good example. Social commerce is another one coming up on the rails. And let's not forget good old fashioned non-digitized broadcast media. People were still managing to buy things in the 80s. Right? It's a truth that consumers will consume. But you're absolutely right. For the rest, it's a challenge. The end of the road is approaching fast. So do we go full Thelma and Louise, or do we reverse a little bit, think about where it is we want to go as consumers, as businesses, and as an industry, and reroute our direction? So some of the options suggest, I think, it's possible to keep the car running, ignore the signs, and hope we can just carry on laying the track as we go. But will that really answer the question? Does it address the challenge we're facing now with consumers not wanting to share their details or their data anymore? And will it satisfy marketers if it's the detail they want, and the intermediaries that sit on this data make their practices more opaque or their definitions more diluted? So, is it missing the point of why privacy is a concern to consumers in the first place?
Right. So now that we have kind of no option, we need to get our collective heads together and land on a real cookieless solution. What things should we keep in mind when evaluating those potential alternatives? And the first is going to be, is it omni-channel? Can you apply it to all of your media channels and audiences? And second, is it evolving your overall advertising strategy? Does it shift you away from identifiers, or is it just rehashing them in a different format? And then the final thing to consider, does it work at scale? Will it allow you to maintain reach whilst also personalizing to your audiences and delivering ads that are relevant?
Absolutely. So omni-channel, channel before audience has been a bit of a lopsided way to do it. So starting with the audiences would always be the recommended approach. Innovation, this evolution of advertising, and being able to deliver something useful at scale are the challenges we're facing. So this balance between privacy and personalization, precision and scale, efficiency and effectiveness, and loyalty and growth. So that's the question, or they are the questions we're taking to the table, the ones we're taking away with us. And now it's time to introduce our Chief Technology Officer, Aaron McKee, to present Blis's solution and to answer some of your questions. So on behalf of Brooke and myself, thank you very much. And over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Brooke. And hopefully everybody was able to follow along. I know that we had a few internet hiccups. That seems to always be the case. By way of introduction, I'm Aaron. I'm Blis's CTO, as it says on the screen. I've been with the company for about 6 years, been in advertising for well over a decade at this point. I think it's one of the most interesting times to be in advertising right now. I think, as we alluded to earlier, there's a lot of changes going on, kind of reminiscent of the rise of programmatic a little over a decade ago. And there's a lot of solutions coming out on how ultimately to solve some of the problems that were outlined a little bit earlier. But what we're seeing is a general lack of preparation, some of the statistics indicate. And a lot of companies offering snake oil or solutions to solve those problems. And it requires all of us to be really savvy about the solutions out there to make sure that they are fundamentally fit for purpose. The definition of what fit for purpose means, though, is going to change. That the systems and solutions and approaches that we've taken to marketing over the past number of years that have been so reliant upon third-party cookies have to change. And anybody that promises that the world isn't going to change is frankly trying to sell you a bill of goods. And I think this is where Alex's points in the previous slide came into bear, is we have to understand what is our North Star as marketers? What are we trying to achieve? We want to be able to measure the effectiveness of our advertising activity. We want that advertising activity to be as simple as run, as homogeneous as possible. And we want to have the audience be at the front and center of everything that we do, and ideally be able to measure the effectiveness of that audience and reach them absolutely everywhere we might find that audience. And ultimately, does it work at scale? Alex took us a little bit through the privacy sandbox. It is, for better or worse, a system that only works for the Google ecosystem. But there's so much more out there than just the Google ecosystem. Similarly, things like UID, ID5, RAMP ID, there's something like 80 different cookie alternatives in the marketplace. The scale of adoption of them is low enough that it's not going to be a sufficient third-party cookie alternative. No matter what we do, we have to change some of our practices. This is going to be a little bit self-facing, but I'm going to take you through a few points of how we are looking at the problem. And one of the things that I say is core to our DNA as a business is we believe a few things at a fundamental level. The first is that the internet should generally be free. We don't want to end up with like micropayments and transactions to access every little thing that we read. And the way that happens is ultimately through advertising, and advertising at scale. However, the currency that we have been using historically has been our personal data. And consumers have been pretty clear about saying that the depth and the breadth of which that personal data is being used as a currency has probably shifted too far towards invasive harvesting of that information. And we talked a little bit about that. There is a way forward on the internet to still have advertising power, the free internet, without having to be creepy about it, without having to come into everybody's individual's personal life at the level of detail that people have been used to. That people should be able to have control over privacy, and companies in the marketing and advertising ecosystem should be able to respect that consent. At the same time, we need to be able to reach as many people as possible to bring those brand messages front and center into people's lives, to give them the opportunity to engage with those brands. So again, this creates that interesting dynamic of trying to find a solution that respects privacy while also being scaled, while also being able to touch every touch point with the consumer. And I'll talk a little bit about how we have approached that problem. When we came into this, we started thinking about this years ago, and it was ultimately tied to GDPR. We, as was mentioned earlier, we're headquartered in the UK. We've been around since 2004. We've been in the US for a while. But GDPR was this really interesting inflection point where there was just simply less personal data out there because people had more control over what they chose to share. And as a British-born business, we had to take that very seriously. We had to embed privacy into the bones and the DNA of our product and not try to find a cookie alternative, because a lot of these cookie alternatives might technically get past the erosion of third-party cookies in a limited context. They're certainly not going to get past the regulators' eyes and scrutinies in markets like those covered by GDPR. So you have to think further ahead. You have to think, what is going to pass regulatory scrutiny? What is going to be okay in the minds of consumers? And what ultimately is going to technically work? And we think we've come up with a solution that works. And there'll be other companies, ideally, hopefully, that come up with similar approaches that also hit these goals. So again, coming back into maybe the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we have done. And these are representations of those ethos points that I mentioned. We have a tool, it's called Audience Explorer. What it does is it looks at consented personal data, and it might not be at massive scale, but it's at a statistically relevant scale. We can understand those consumers that have consented, have set a cookie or a mobile advertising ID, and we can see them when they engage with the real world through their movement patterns. We can see them when they're members of loyalty lists from client first-party data. We can see them in a whole bunch of other contexts. But what we do is we can look at them as an analysis panel, and we can figure out what makes them unique versus the general population. So we might see that this member of your loyalty card database lives in zip code 90210 in America. Well, we can compare that user in 90210 against their neighbors in 90210, and we can figure out what makes them unique. And that might be things like the areas that they live, the areas that drive the most visitation for like an IKEA, or the most engagement, the loyalty application. We can see the type of content that they consume, whether those are TV shows or whether those are websites that they engage with, whether those are games that they play. We can see when they do these things. We can see other factors like that. The important part is those characteristics that we can model, that we can understand, that we can statistically analyze are fundamentally anonymous. And even in their combination, still are fundamentally anonymous. And we can turn that observed, directly measured personal data from people who have chosen to share their data from a planning perspective, an insights perspective. We can turn that into an activation plan that no longer requires personal data at all to deliver the campaign or even to measure the effectiveness of the campaign. And that's really powerful. That opens up a huge amount of scale. It allows us to reach across every single channel, and it allows us to perform quite well. And again, this is in contrast to some of the other ways that people have been trying to solve this problem. And one of the problems that exists with the cookie alternatives, or even legacy ways of buying, for example, omni-channel type activity, is oftentimes the data sets are quite fragmented. The way you build up an audience on CTV is different than the way you build up an audience on digital out of home, different again than the way you would build that up in the programmatic display channels. People end up planning all these things in isolation because they take that channel first approach to how they work. That solution I just mentioned about looking at an audience, your directly measurable audience, as a seed analysis, connecting it to a holistic planning process that doesn't require deep personal data for the activation. The benefit of that is you can apply that plan across every single channel. This is what we're able to enable with our Audience and Explorer platform. You can find people that are loyal users of your application. You can find people that go to IKEA or like long walks on the beach. You can understand what makes them unique, and then you can activate them across digital out of home, across CTV, across programmatic display, across every reachable channel out there with that one audience layer applied across all of those channels. And that really simplifies life, that simplifies measurement, and it's a really effective solution. And I guess moving on to sort of the next thing is that capability, that competency, if we go to the next slide, also enables you to reach not just incremental channels, but incremental users on the existing channels. Again, coming back to some of the things that Alex and Brooke talked about, cookies have already been phased out in most platforms. And we're talking a lot about, this is finally the year as cookies goes away. Cookies have been away for ages. And I think when you look at even just the traditional mobile or web ecosystems, at best you have an addressability of about 50% of the available inventory out there. For the most part, you don't get iOS and Safari on MacBooks. You don't get Firefox. You have limited ability to reach out on browsers like Edge. Right now, for the most part, most people, when they buy a brand new laptop, it does not come with Chrome. Somebody has to be, technically savvy enough to go install Chrome as an aftermarket browser. And Google has clearly been very successful at convincing people to do that. But it is still ultimately not the default browser in most environments. My mom still uses Safari on her MacBook. These people are unaddressable. And if you are a big brand, I'm sure you don't only want to be targeting Android phones and people using Chrome as an aftermarket browser in whatever their device of choice is. That's already a limitation that people are facing today. But because the audiences are so big, people have kind of ignored that problem. When we look at FMCG or CPG type activities that are running, selling anything from nappies to toothpaste to pet food, a lot of those campaigns that are being run on legacy platforms are only targeting those environments. And that's limiting the effectiveness of your brand message. It's limiting the effectiveness of bringing net new customers and net new sales to your business. And that's already a problem that people are facing and largely ignoring today, and will no longer be able to ignore coming across this year as Chrome finally gets rid of cookies. The solution we talked about, because we've connected everything to effectively anonymous, non-channel specific, non-browser specific signals, like the content you're consuming, roughly where do you live or where do you work, the times and the days that you engage with content, engage with advertising. Because we've connected to those factors, we can show ads effectively across every browser platform out there, every type of screen. And that restores your ability to reach your brands and drive incremental sales and drive brand uplift in a way that simply has not been possible today at the precision that we're able to see. And again, if we move on to the next slide, some of these solutions that people talk about, they might have cracked the targeting solution to some extent, but what they don't also have is an ability to crack the measurement solution. And as we all know, if you can't measure your advertising, at some point your CFO or CMO is going to come to you and say, why are we spending so much money on this particular topic? You need to be able to measure the effectiveness of the audiences you're reaching and the campaigns that you're running. And you need to be able to do that in a way that scales. And so much of modern measurement is ultimately tied to things like multi-touch attribution or media mix modeling and so forth. And there's pearls of wisdom in here, and there's kernels of truth that carry forward. But ultimately, as the cookie becomes less and less common, and as the scale limitations of things like UID, RAMP ID, ID5, and those other alternative cookie solutions becomes more manifest, people are going to be asking themselves, well, how do I actually effectively measure these campaigns? I think in general, and this is, a statistic I've seen other people report as well, maybe 20 to 30% of media trading opportunities, bid requests, are enriched with one of these alternative IDs. And that's a challenge, because ultimately that means there's going to be a huge pool of bidders competing on those limited amount of identities. And already, as sort of Alex took us through, those identities are already fragmented. If you're using your email address or your phone number ultimately as part of your advertising ID, indirectly or otherwise, again, you have your personal email address, you have your work email address, you have your family email address. Your ability to stitch that story together into a consistent measurement is quite impacted, is quite limited. You need a measurement approach that doesn't require that you attribute a single impression via an ID to an outcome based on that. And one of the approaches that we have taken is an evolution of using geo holdouts, being able to effectively identify the parts of a map that you would show ads to, the parts of a map that you don't show ads to. But you might say, well, that's been around for 100 years. What's unique about that? The approach that we're taking is solving some of the problems that have existed in data analytics for quite a while, which is ultimately, how do I make sure that my two audiences, the ones that see ads, the ones that don't see ad, are balanced and effective, and we minimize the pollution of these two pools across each other. So we're able to select factors to control for, whether it's household income, whether that's commute time, whether that's engagement with a particular brand, and statistically control for those as we dynamically build up the sets of, in America, zip codes or postal districts in the UK and abroad, the sets of areas you show ads to and the sets of areas that you don't. Even beyond that, because of our heritage in understanding movement data at a really high quality level, we actually look at the rate at which we see people cross from one zip code or area into another, and we can control for that. You don't want to have a group that sees ads actually end up effectively being the same audience of the ones that you thought were not seeing ads. That dilutes the impact and the measurability of your campaigns. We're able to take this approach, we call it smart holdout groups, and we're able to apply it to effectively any type of measurement that is relevant to your campaign. Brand uplift, whether that's online conversions, whether that's footfall, and so on. And again, we think that's really important because it doesn't require cookies via an attribution chain to connect to the impressions that we're ultimately delivering. That restores that scale, that restores the ability to measure the effectiveness of activity independent of channel to the outcome that you ultimately want to see. And I guess moving on, and this is something that's less tied to the cookies, but another core part of our ethos. What we believe as a technology platform is that we shouldn't be paid more just because you're buying more expensive media. The people that power the internet, the reason we spend so much time on the internet are the people that create the contents and the publishers and the websites that provide access to that content. Most of your marketing dollars should be going to those entities. So we ultimately do all of this via a data fee. And that data fee is capped so that if you're buying really expensive media, we don't necessarily get paid more than if you're buying normal display media. We think that's an important part of this equation, delivering that competency in the way where publishers continue to get paid for the high value content that they ultimately deliver. And again, moving on, I think just to summarize everything, we believe that you should be able to access detailed audiences that go beyond the one-dimensional view of pure contextual targeting across any sort of channel. And you need to be able to do that without relying upon cookies or IDs. We believe that also allows you to connect with your audience better and make sure that your advertising is effectively unmissable across all of the various ways that you can find that audience out in the wild. You need to be able to measure the effectiveness of that, and ideally more of your money is going directly to the media. And again, these are some of the things that have been driving how we have approached solving this problem. The obvious question that a lot of people ask at this point is, well, that all sounds absolutely wonderful. Yeah, it's great. It has scale, but how does it actually work? And if we go into the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. And these are 3 case studies from real brands that we've worked with, where we've seen that this approach of basically delivering much higher scaled campaigns or opening up audiences over a lot more dimensions has actually yielded far superior performance in many cases than what has even been possible using cookies while they still exist. So, for example, with a major national big box retailer that you would all know, we delivered a 20% increase in CTR versus ID targeting, run side by side in a clean testing environment. We saw a 12% increase in video completion rates versus ID targeting for a major oral care brand that you would be familiar with. And for a multinational coffee chain, an 18% increase in CTR. And frankly, these are some of the more conservative case studies that we've pulled out that we're quite comfortable putting forward. We also ran activities earlier in this year alone for a major telephone introduction, major phone introduction, put $1 million behind traditional targeting and $1 million behind non-traditional targeting using our technology. I saw roughly a doubling of the CTR, 50% improvement in video completion rates, significant reductions in the cost per click and ultimately the CPM of the media delivered. There's huge efficiencies that come to bear once you free yourself of the ID. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is you're actually finding your audience in ways that other people are not able to find them. But there's also efficiencies because this opens up so much more scale of impressions, so much more scale of access across the media landscape. You're able to be more effective and efficient with how you optimize your campaigns, automated or manual or otherwise. You can really find the best possible moments, the best possible times, the best possible opportunities out there to reach those customers because you have so much scale at your disposal that you can trade that for performance. And again, we're kind of seeing and many marketers have seen this as well, as the ID pool has shifted, the competitiveness for those IDs is increasing because everybody wants those last few cookies are out there, and that's driving market prices way up. This is another way of restoring efficiency to your campaigns, getting better performance, frankly, at in many cases, a lower eCPM to actually transact that as well. That's probably me for now for talking about ultimately our solution and our approach to that. If you go to the next slide, we'll show you a QR code that you can scan. We'd be happy to set up a demo of how we've solved that problem. You can talk to any one of us out there and we can geek out on the different sorts of solutions in the market and show you what we think will help you get to the next level. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Lori to open it up to a couple questions.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. Super insightful. And thank you, Brooke and Alex. I know everything that you all have kind of touched on today, from our study to our solutions, will undoubtedly open up some questions from our audiences. And so with a few minutes that we have left, I figured, Aaron, we could have a Q&A and kind of talk through a couple of questions that come up pretty frequently for me when I'm having conversations with my clients about moving towards an ID-free world. I know that you touched on this a little bit, but figured we could kind of go back to one of the core questions that we get a lot. I think this is the number one question I get is really, what's going on with Chrome's privacy sandbox and UIDs 2.0? And Aaron, I think you kind of touched on this before, but do we think this is going to work? Are these going to become the standard for an ID-less world?
Yeah, I think we all have to be aware of the privacy sandbox. It's a big initiative, and I think Chrome is going to be locking some things down to make certain things harder. One of the things that we like about our solution is whether somebody is using the privacy sandbox or not, we're able to deliver those benefits independent of third-party cookies or independent of privacy sandbox technologies. I guess the one thing I would say about privacy sandbox, or maybe the two things I would say about them, right now, the indication from the IAB, they've done like a tech lab report. I think Mediavine did a wonderful post from their own testing with it. It appears to be quite limited in its effectiveness in terms of the performance that it actually delivers. And it seems to have quite a few constraints that are really limiting people's ability to perform effective marketing. And we all know that we are moving through a transition point where everything is going to have to change anyways. So just because everything has to change doesn't mean it all has to change purely for the worse. And I think many people are finding that the compromises that privacy sandbox poses make their job effectively impossible or very difficult. We'll see. One of the challenges, as was alluded to earlier, sandbox is sort of a word that means testing environment. And one of the reasons it's taken so long for marketers to even begin testing privacy sandbox is it's a constantly changing platform. The specifications are changing. The names of the technologies are changing. The ensemble of what is or is not in the privacy sandbox keeps changing. So I think there hasn't been a stable footing for people to get a really good sense of ultimately, what is this thing and how can I use it? The ones that have been digging in, like the tech lab, finding a few red flags that people should be aware of. Whether those get resolved or not is an open question. I think ultimately the thing that is not an open question, it's unlikely anybody other than Google is going to adopt the privacy sandbox. So it comes back to, do you really want to deeply invest in a technology solution or approach that really openly opens up one particular browser or one particular phone family out there? I think ultimately marketers need to be able to reach more audiences than just that. They need to have a solution that spans beyond the Google ecosystem, whether or not they support the privacy sandbox or not.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you. And, I think the root of the confusion around a lot of conversations that we're having today around, the cookieless future is what it means to marketers, what cookie deprecation will actually mean for the advertisers and their digital ad strategies. So, are you able to highlight kind of on the common misconceptions around the deprecation of a third-party cookie?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for a long time about this. I think one of the misconceptions is that cookies are only going away in 2024 from due to Google. Cookies have been gone for years in many platforms. And I'm using cookies in the open liberal sort of sense, meaning obviously web cookies from a browser, but also mobile advertising IDs. I mean, a couple of years ago, Apple introduced their app tracking and transparency framework, where now we all get on our iPhones this little pop-up says this app would like to track you across sites. Unsurprisingly, 80% of people say no to that. And that's impacted the addressability and measurability of iPhone audiences for ages. And what have many marketers done? Well, they've compensated by now doing a lot more of their advertising purely on Android to the detriment of their brand reach. So the misconception in some cases is that this is the year that cookies go away. Now, this is the year that cookies finally die, but they've been on life support for a while. And I think the effectiveness of our marketing campaigns has already been impacted in many ways because we're missing out on other browsers, other environments, and we're continuing to chase things using a diminishingly useful tool, which is a third party cookie.
Yeah, very well said, I think. Thank you for highlighting on that. And, I think with all that in mind and considering how much advertisers stand to lose if they don't address this final life supported piece of cookies very soon, to wrap this up and leave our audience with, Aaron, what would you say is the most critical changes that we must make to face the future effectively here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll share my own view and obviously very keen to see what other people think about this as well. I think ultimately there's a lot of desperation. People have waited to the last minute to try to address this problem. And it's understandable. It's complex and it's a shifting environment. But one of the things where I think people are going to have a hard time is if they expect that life isn't going to change and they just need to change from tech A to tech B, whether that's third party cookies to an alternative ID, I think they'll be in for disappointment. This is an opportunity for marketers to look at their technology and their approach to marketing, whether that's planning, buying, or measurement as well. And they're going to have to make changes to that, changes to the assumptions that drive that. And some of those changes are ultimately going to deliver far better performance, but they are a change in mindset. It's going to be less possible now to say, I'm going to show this product that you saw on my website to you in a retargeted ad. And then ultimately see if you went comparison shopping on 3 other websites before you went and bought that on my or another retailer. That is going to change. If I'm in the market for a TV, I'm going to go to 4 or 5, 12, 20 different comparison sites to look at reviews. I'm probably going to shop around on 5, 6, 20 different retailers to compare prices. And historically with third-party cookies, we would see a lot of that shopping journey. And now we're going to see fragments of that at best. If we try to limit our advertising and marketing to just those microscopic little pools that are measurable, the effectiveness of our campaigns is going to be impacted. Ultimately, we have to change how we approach both the planning, the activation, and ultimately the measurement to look at a solution that allows us to reach our full audience and stitch the pieces together. And to some extent, that will mean a shift from one-to-one measurement to probabilistic measurement to slightly less deterministic measurement. But we can still do that in a way that we have confidence on the returns of our investment. And again, it's going to take a bit of an open mind, a bit of consultancy, a bit of being creative with how we look at the ultimate problem we're trying to solve for our brands, for our marketers, and figuring out new ways of solving them using, in many cases, new technologies.
Yeah, thank you. That's super insightful. And I always like hearing all about your knowledge and your POV on everything. It's super helpful to understand kind of how to best position ourselves. And the audience is here today. We would also love to hear how you are approaching the demise of cookies and third-party cookies, essentially. So what we're doing is we are running a fun competition on the Great Privacy Disconnect landing page. In true 2020 fashion, post 2020, you can scan the QR code here and be taken to that landing page and fill out a few questions about how you're preparing for this year. And by doing so, you'll be entered to win a pair of Apple AirPod Maxes, something that's been on my wish list for quite a while. So definitely encourage you to go. We'd love to hear your thoughts and get a fun prize from it as well. And thank you again for everyone for tuning in. We hope that you've learned more about the reality of a cookieless advertising era and how Blis can help. Head to our landing page to uncover more on our insights, as well as you can go to the URL page listed right here, which is blis.com/book a demo to book a demonstration of our game-changing platform. So thank you again for everyone for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the session today.